Hey everybody, this is Chapter 4 of Mao Zedong, A Political and Intellectual Portrait by Maurice Meisner. Chapter 4 is titled Nationalism and Social Revolution, 1935 to 1949. First section, The Long March. When plans for the exodus from Jiangxi were being made in the summer of 1934, Mao Zedong had been stripped of all real power in the CCP by Russian-supported, quote, return students, even though he retained the now empty title of chairman of the Chinese Soviet Republic. Mao's views ignored by most party members. His views ignored by most party members. Party leaders. Jesus Christ. Mao retreated to a Taoist temple in the countryside where he lived quietly with his second wife, Ho Zizhen, and their 2-year-old son. Isolating himself from the top leaders of the Jiangxi Soviet, save for Zhou and Lai, he confined himself to local social and political affairs. Mao joined the flight, linking up with the long procession of retreating Red Army soldiers on October 18, 1934. He had little choice. He would have been executed by the Kuomintang had he remained in Jiangxi. Ho Zizhen also joined the exodus, one of the 20 or so women who embarked on the retreat, most wives of party leaders who served as nurses. Mostly wives of party leaders who served as nurses. The 2-year-old child, perforce, was left behind in the care of friends. The disasters that befell the fleeing Communist army early on the Long March soon thrust Mao back into the center of party politics. Overwhelmed by the difficulties of managing a military force constantly on the march in the rural hinterlands, the authority of the urban-oriented leaders over the Red Army began to wane and was further undermined by their military inexperience. A fierce 5-day battle with the large GMD force, dispatched to block their crossing of the Xiang River, resulted in the loss of nearly half the Red Army barely a month after their departure from Jiangxi. Now many Red Army officers and political cadres once again began to look to Mao Zedong. He was remembered as a military genius, the builder of the Red Army facing seemingly impossible conditions on the Jinggangshan, and an innovative tactician who successfully resisted Chiang Kai-shek's first 3, quote, encirclement and annihilation, end quote, campaigns. In the renewed battle with the Moscow-installed Chinese communists, the political terrain of the Long March favored Mao. In a communist movement now more than ever confined to remote parts of the countryside, Mao had great advantages over the young urban-oriented leaders favored by Stalin. Physically, emotionally, and politically, he had immersed himself in rural life for a decade. The political experience of the, quote, returned students, by contrast, had been molded in Moscow and Shanghai. They were ill-prepared for life and for political life in a backward rural environment, much less with a fleeing military force pursued by far larger armies. When the Long March halted at the town of Zunyi, in impoverished Guizhou province, in early January 1935, a rump session of the Chinese Communist Party Politburo, attended by 6 of its 12 members, put Mao in effective control of what remained of the Red Army. Although the internal party struggle was to continue until the early 1940s, the 41-year-old Mao was now the dominant leader in the party and sufficiently in control of the army to pursue his own policies and the tactics of mobile warfare he favored. The grip of the Comintern finally had been loosened, and Mao had gained a degree of supremacy in the Chinese party in defiance of Stalin. It was an event unprecedented in the history of the communist parties in the Stalinist era. In early 1935, however, Mao's triumph was more about sheer physical survival than political power. The Red Army had been reduced to a demoralized force of 30,000, barely a third of the number that had fled Jiangxi 3 months before, and the most difficult part of the journey lay ahead. across the raging rivers, forbidding mountains, and dangerous marshes of western China. It was the only route to the sanctuary that the communists now decided to seek in the barren northwest province of Shanxi, where a small communist base had survived since the early 1930s. It was to take another 9 months for the Red Army to reach Shanxi, and that was to prove the most perilous portion of the incredible year-long journey. That was to prove the most perilous portion of the incredible year-long journey. In Mao's account, the Red Army, quote, traveled across the longest and deepest and most dangerous rivers of China, across some of its highest and most hazardous mountain passes, through the country of fierce aborigines, or aborigine, or aborigines, I don't know, through the empty grasslands, through cold and through intense heat, through wind and snow and rainstorm, pursued by half the white armies of China, and fighting its way past the local warlord troops. At least we reached northern Shenxi in October 1935, end quote. Now, by any standard of historical and human judgment, the Long March stands as one of the most remarkable sagas of human courage and endurance in world history. It was, as Edgar Snow wrote in 1937, quote, an odyssey unequaled in modern times, end quote. Few of those who embarked on the torturous 6,000-mile journey in October 1934 survived the ordeal. Only 8,000 half-starved soldiers remained when Mao led the main force of the Red Army into northern Shanxi in the fall of 1935, finally finding sanctuary just south of the ancient Great Wall. Of the approximately 86,000 men and 20 women who marched out of Jiangxi in 1934, most were now dead, victims of the many battles fought along the way, of the persistent Guomindang aerial bombardments, the relentless outbreaks of illness, and the perils of an unremittingly harsh landscape of craggy mountains, icy gorges, raging rivers, and lethal swamplands. Among the dead left along the circuitous route to Shanxi were many of Mao Zedong's closest friends and comrades and one of his two young brothers, Mao Zedong, killed in one of the many battles, and the child who was left behind in care of a sympathetic peasant family in Jiangxi was never to be found. The awareness among the survivors of the Long March that they lived while so many others died lent a sacred character to their revolutionary mission and inspired an extraordinary sense of dedication to complete it. While there is little to suggest that Mao Zedong was tormented by the guilt that survivors often bear, he did feel the need to vindicate the sacrifices that so many had made by rededicating himself to the revolutionary cause. He was certainly acutely aware of his own defiance of death, while so many of those around him were killed. In an interview with Edgar Snow in 1965, Mao recounted the losses of close comrades and family members, noted some of the many times he had barely eluded what seemed certain death. He found it, quote, odd that he had survived, and remarked that, quote, death just did not seem to want him, end quote. The consciousness of having defied death undoubtedly contributed to Mao's growing sense of infallibility, and his perception that he was a leader destined to lead his followers to the completion of their revolutionary mission. The fact of survival became a matter of enormous psychological significance for Mao, and indeed for all, quote, the veterans of the Long March, end quote. It was also a matter of enormous political consequence. Survival against such heavy odds was taken as testimony not only to the validity of the revolution, but also to the wisdom of its leader and his policies. Indeed, the cult of Mao was born out of the harsh and extraordinary experiences of the Long March, for Mao now began to be surrounded by a certain mystique and looked upon as a prophet and savior. In celebrating the personal heroism of the veterans of the Long March, later Chinese communist accounts hail it as a great victory, heralding the triumph of 1949. Victory did not seem so likely at the time, however. Mao Zedong later candidly acknowledged the gravity of the defeat. Quote, all the revolutionary bases except the Shanxi Gansu border area were lost. The Red Army were reduced from 300,000 to a few tens of thousands. The membership of the Chinese Communist Party fell from 300,000 to a few tens of thousands, and the party organizations in the Kuomintang areas were almost all destroyed. In short, we paid a severe penalty of historic proportions. End quote. Mao. The military weakness of the Communists in the fall of 1935 was exacerbated by the barrenness of the remote territory where they were now confined. Northern Shanxi was one of the most backward areas of China, its infertile land capable of supporting only a small and impoverished population. Nonetheless, however in favor of the circumstances, the tiny communist base in northern Shanxi survived. The Red Army fought off attacking Kuomintang and warlord armies and gradually expanded the sparsely populated areas under its control. At the beginning of 1937, the communists were sufficiently secure to move their capital 50 miles southeast to the obscure town of Yan'an, recently evacuated by nationalist troops. An ancient city founded some 3,000 years ago, Yan'an declined over the centuries as Chinese civilization moved south. It was a poor, dusty, and remote frontier town of about 10,000 inhabitants when the Communists made it their capital in January 1937. At the time, the Red Army numbered about 50,000 soldiers, and the Communists governed a poverty-stricken area in the northwest which supported an almost entirely rural population of barely 1 million people. Yet from these unpromising circumstances, the Communist movement grew with extraordinary rapidity over what later came to be celebrated as the, quote, Yan'an Decade. During the most crucial period, the CCP, now marching under an unambiguous Maoist banner, mobilized the support of tens of millions of peasants in the countryside of North China, as well as substantial popular support in the cities. In 1945, the Red Army had grown to a regular military force of over 1 million dedicated soldiers, supported by armed peasant militias of part-time fighters and part-time farmers numbering several million. The Communist Party of China could claim an active membership of 1,200,000. Such was the organizational basis for the Communist victories in the massive battles that marked the final stage of the Civil War, fought between 1946 and 1948. In January 1949, exactly 12 years after the Communists moved their headquarters to Yan'an, Mao Zedong stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Palace in Beijing to proclaim the founding of the People's Republic of China. How did a tiny and ill-equipped army isolated in the barren and sparsely populated lowest lands of northern Shanxi, an army and political movement chronically on the verge of extinction, mobilize such enormous popular support? How, in little more than a decade, did Maoists come to power in the world's most populous land and carry out the most thoroughgoing social revolution in modern history? New section. Maoism and Nationalism. War and revolution are initially intimately associated in modern history, and nowhere did this relationship find clearer and more dramatic expression than in China. For it is difficult to imagine how the Maoist victory of 1949 could have come about had it not been for the Japanese invasion of 1937, its impact on Chinese society and politics, and especially the ability of the Communists to capture the banner of Chinese national resistance to foreign aggression. A modernizing and militaristic Japan had threatened China for nearly half a century before the full-scale invasion of 1937, beginning with the aggressive war of 1894 to 95 and the colonization of Taiwan, seized by the Japanese as war booty. Japan emerged as the most aggressive of the imperialist powers threatening China in 1915 when it presented the infamous, quote, 21 Demands, which sought to make the whole of China a Japanese colony. The actual colonization of the Chinese mainland began in 1931 when the Japanese army took over Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. The Japanese Imperial Army followed with increasingly provocative incursions into North China, culminating with the full-scale invasion launched in the summer of 1937. Between 1932 and 1937, the Kuomintang undermined its nationalist credentials by its reluctance to confront the growing Japanese threat. It was necessary to defeat the Communists and achieve national unity before facing the Japanese, Chiang Kai-shek explained. Thus the Kuomintang followed a policy of appeasement, retreating before the relentless Japanese advance, while devoting the greater part of its considerable military power to various extermination and annihilation campaigns against the communists. Was an unpopular policy which cost the Nationalist Party much of its nationalist legitimacy. In the meantime, the communists were fortifying their nationalist credentials, appealing for a united front of all patriotic Chinese to protect the nation from Japanese aggression. In 1932, as chairman of the Chinese Soviet Republic in Jiangxi, Mao issued a declaration of war against Japan, a purely symbolic gesture at a time when the Red Army was weak and isolated in a province some 2,000 miles distant from the Japanese army in Manchuria. But once the communists had established a secure base in northern Shanxi, Mao Zedong's call for a national unity to resist Japan became far more credible and politically effective. The Yan'an base area was within several hundred miles of Japanese troops, gradually moving south from Manchuria and Mongolia. On the eve of the full-scale Japanese assault, the communists were geographically well placed to organize a movement to national resistance. A movement of national resistance. Hardly 2 months after the conclusion of the Long March, at a Politburo meeting in late December 1935, Mao Zedong called for a, quote, national united front, unquote, of all the Chinese people to oppose Japanese imperialism, but excluded from the National Alliance were large landlords, big warlords, high bureaucrats, and compradors, and their, quote, political chieftain Chiang Kai-shek, unquote. These groups constituted no more than a, quote, camp of traitors, unquote, and therefore were not to be counted as part of the, quote, people, or, quote, all the people. In proposing a broad united front, Mao placed special emphasis on the progressive political potential of the, quote, national bourgeoisie. Implicit in this term was an economic distinction between a, quote, comprador sector of the bourgeoisie, economically dependent on foreign imperialism, and a, quote, national bourgeoisie, whose economic interests were domestically oriented and were thus opposed to imperialism. Yet what seemed a socio-economic distinction really was one based on subjective political attitudes and behavior. The, quote, national bourgeoisie was defined by Mao not according to objective economic and social criteria, but almost solely on the basis of its political willingness to join a communist-led united front to oppose Japanese imperialism. This stood in striking contrast to the elaborate class distinctions based on careful consideration of concrete socioeconomic factors that distinguished Mao's detailed social investigations, and it marked the appearance of a Maoist tendency to define class more on the basis of political attitudes than according to objective Marxian economic and social criteria. To encourage the national Japanese to participate in a popular national front against the Japanese, Mao vowed, quote, during the period of bourgeois democratic revolution, we will not expropriate private property other than imperialist and feudal private property, and far from confiscating the national bourgeoisie's industrial and commercial enterprises, we will rather encourage their development. We shall protect any national capitalist who does not support imperialism or the Chinese traders. During the stage of democratic revolution, there were limits to the struggle between labor and capital. The labor laws of the People's Republic will protect the interests of the workers, but will not oppose the national bourgeoisies making profits or developing national industrial and commercial enterprises, end quote. Mao. It might appear that Mao's discovery of the, quote, national bourgeoisie at the end of 1935 and his encouragement of private industrial and commercial enterprise reflected a Marxist belief in the progressiveness of capitalism. There is little reason to believe that this was the case. Since 1925, Mao had ignored the cities and modern social classes who inhabited them, looking instead to the backward countryside and the pre-capitalist peasantry for the sources of revolution and progress. Mao's interest in the bourgeoisie in the mid-1930s derived not from any newfound Marxian faith in the progressiveness of capitalism, but rather from a non-Marxian nationalism. The overriding need was to repel the Japanese invaders, a need that brought forth Mao's populist concept of the Chinese people as a more or less organic entity whose common interests submerged all social class differences. Thus, all of the Chinese people were potentially part of the quote, revolutionary united front. Mao's embrace of the bourgeoisie in 1935 was motivated more by nationalist than Marxist considerations. In a land so deeply impinged upon by foreign powers for nearly a century, it was inevitable that the appeals and content of Marxism would be closely bound up with nationalism. The combination of Marxism and nationalism may be an unholy alliance, but it was one inherent in the origins of Chinese communism. It was an alliance that the Japanese invasion greatly fortified. While all Chinese communists were perforce nationalists, in the sense that they were above all concerned with the fate of China in a world of rapacious nation-states, some strove to reconcile their nationalist feelings with the internationalist principles of their new Marxist creed. The most notable effort was made by the first leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Chen Dushou, with whom Mao Zedong had so contentious a relationship in the mid-1920s. Chen Dushou is the leading intellectual in the anti-traditionalist and westernizing new culture movement of 1915 to 1919, and his conversion to Marxism had greatly inspired Mao Zedong's adoption of the doctrine in 1920. While Chen Dushou's turn to Bolshevism had grown out of nationalist disillusionment with the West, he was drawn to the more cosmopolitan and modernistic features of Marxism, embracing the emphasis on cities as the centers of progress and the urban proletariat as the international agent of liberation. His revolutionary hopes centered on China's urban workers who, however few in number, were members of a social class formed in the cosmopolitan image of the advanced countries of the West. And Chen was also very, very democratic in orientation. And it seems like there's also a degree to which Gregor Benton has noted how Chen Dushou was older than a lot of other people in the Chinese Communist movement. Not like an old man by any means, but he did not have the attitude of viewing the Bolsheviks as the Russian Bolsheviks as wise elders, and thus didn't had more of an independent spirit vis-a-vis Moscow early on. By contrast, Mao Zedong, after a brief and frustrating effort to build a working-class movement in agrarian Hunan, came to look to the countryside for the sources of revolution and to the peasantry as the essence of the Chinese nation. After having discovered the revolutionary potential of the peasants in early 1925, he devoted himself to the countryside and its inhabitants, largely ignoring the cities and the proletariat. The peasants not only made up the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people, Mao repeatedly emphasized, but they were the carriers of the best and most progressive aspects of China's national culture. He therefore lauded the peasantry's, quote, fine ancient popular culture that is more or less democratic and revolutionary in character, end quote. Mao. Marxists traditionally looked upon peasants as carriers of a culturally and politically conservative nationalism. The peasantry, as Trotsky said, quote, by virtue of its entire history and the condition of its existence, is the least international of all classes. What are commonly called national traits have their chief source precisely in the peasantry. End quote. Trotsky. It was a view shared by Chen Dushou, who joined the left opposition. I don't know if I'll say that or not. It was a view shared by Chen Dushou, who saw the peasantry as the repository of China's pernicious cultural traditions, the source of its economic backwardness and social stagnation. But what Marxist internationalists such as Trotsky and Chen saw as a fatal deficiency in the revolutionary potential of the peasantry was for Mao a major virtue. His nationalism drew him not to the foreign-dominated cities but to the peasants in the countryside, as the truly revolutionary class and the embodiment of the nation. And this perception was to facilitate his mobilization of the peasantry on the basis of a program of national resistance to foreign invaders, defying orthodox Marxist views both on the political role of peasants and the place of nationalism in the making of modern revolutions. There is little to suggest that Mao was troubled by the contradiction between Marxism and nationalism, or that he was even aware of the incongruity. As it was, the increasingly ominous Japanese threat fused Chinese nationalism with communist political interests. We cannot even discuss communism if we are robbed of a country in which to practice it, Mao observed in July 1936 in an interview with Edgar Snow. The organization of a movement of nationalist resistance to the foreign invaders became a matter of political survival for both the communists and the nationalists, and effective resistance to the Japanese. It seemed to many required cooperation with the two warring Chinese political parties. Yet the differences between the communists and the Kuomintang seemed irreconcilable. The massacres that had accompanied Chiang Kai-shek's betrayal of the First United Front in 1927 and the White Terror that followed were still fresh in the minds of the communists, and a decade of civil war with its various extermination and annihilation campaigns. It shed much more blood and exacerbated the particularly bitter hatreds that civil wars engender. Mao himself had lost family members, friends, and colleagues during these years, as had most other communists. Few were disposed to ally themselves with what they saw as a party of butchers and traitors. When Mao Zedong called for a broad united front against the Japanese invaders at the end of 1935, he proposed an alliance of social classes, not an alliance of political parties. The national bourgeoisie was now invited to join workers, peasants, students, and the petty bourgeoisie in a National Revolutionary United Front led by the Communist Party. Chiang Kai-shek was not invited to join the alliance. Instead, he was denounced as the chieftain of a camp of traitors. Yet powerful forces inexorably were bringing the two warring parties to some sort of an accommodation, however much they distrusted each other. The Japanese army moving southward from Manchuria, was becoming increasingly aggressive in North China, and it was clearly only a matter of time before it launched a full-scale invasion. As Mao Zedong warned at the end of 1935, now Japanese imperialism wants to convert the whole of China from a semi-colony shared by several imperialist powers into a colony monopolized by Japan, Mao. It was a fear shared by much of the Chinese population as well as by the leaders of the Kuomintang. For Mao and the Chinese Communist pressure to once again ally themselves with the Kuomintang came from Moscow, as well as from the perils to the Chinese nation posed by the Japanese army. From mid-1935, the Comintern demanded the establishment of popular fronts against German and Japanese fascism, both threats to the Soviet Union. The United Fronts were to include such conservative nationalists as Chiang Kai-shek, for whom, in any event, Stalin had a certain admiration, with whom the Soviet Union had maintained relatively cordial diplomatic relations for a decade. While Mao hardly shared Stalin's benign view of Chiang, nationalist impulses as well as political self-interest encouraged him to seek an accommodation with the Kuomintang against the foreign invaders. The force favoring a new communist-nationalist alliance were reinforced by public opinion, articulated by students and intellectuals in the cities, demanding unity against the Japanese. By the summer of 1936, Maoist accusations that Chiang was a traitor to the nation largely ceased. The spontaneous patriotic movement in the cities found dramatic expression in the very army that Chiang Kai-shek had stationed in Shanxi to crush the communists. The Northeast Army, originally a warlord force based in Manchuria, now led by the young marshal, Zheng Shuliang, had been incorporated into Chiang's nationalist army, headquartered at the ancient capital of Xi'an in southern Shanxi. Its mission was to destroy the communists now based in the northern part of the province. But the troops of the Northeast Army, their Manchurian homeland under Japanese occupation since 1931, had little taste for fighting other Chinese. Mao wasted little time in appealing to the patriotic sentiments of the Manchurian troops, not refraining from such chauvinistic reminders that they, like the soldiers of the Red Army, were, descendants of the Yellow Emperor, Mao's nationalist appeals fell on receptive ears. Negotiations between the communists and envoys of Zheng Shuliang began in February 1936. Warfare between the Red Army and the Northeastern Army virtually ceased, and fraternization between the two armies grew. At the same time, Mao, pressured by both Moscow and Shen Shuliang, reluctantly began to seek to include Chiang Kai-shek in an anti-Japanese united front. Stalin, desperate to form anti-fascist united fronts to ward off a Japanese attack on the Soviet Union, insisted that only Chiang had sufficient prestige and power to make a Chinese united front effective. Stalin admired Chiang as a strong ruler, a powerful symbol of Chinese nationalism, and the Chinese politician most likely to effectively resist Japanese expansion. Zheng Shulang had come to the same conclusion. Mao Zedong isolated in barren lowlands of northern Shanxi, with an ill-equipped army that numbered barely 50,000 soldiers, had little choice but to seek an accommodation with his old foe, despite many misgivings. But Chiang Kai-shek responded by launching fresh attacks against the Red Army, employing new forces in addition to such units as the Northeast Army that would obey his orders. Chiang also arrested, quote, Third Force intellectuals who advocated a united resistance to Japan, and Chiang Kai-shek held, no less strong than before, to the dogma of the communists that the communists must be suppressed before effective resistance to Japan could be undertaken. Chiang's continuing refusal to join the communists in a national resistance movement provoked popular outrage, especially among urban intellectuals and the Manchurian soldiers of the Northeast Army. These nationalist resentments found dramatic expression on December 12, 1936, when Zhang Shulang, after considerable soul-searching, finally ordered the arrest of Chiang Kai-shek in Xi'an, where Chiang was visiting for the third time in 3 months, futilely attempting to organize a more vigorous, quote, extermination campaign against the communists. The aim of the, quote, young marshal was to hold Chiang prisoner until he agreed to call off the civil war and unite with all Chinese patriots, including the communists, in a coalition government to lead the anti-Japanese resistance. After 2 weeks in captivity, Chiang reluctantly agreed to unite with the communists in a war of national resistance to Japanese aggression. Although this oral treatment was by no means made explicit, when Chiang was released on December 25th, 1936, it was to take another 8 months of negotiations, haggling, and political intrigues before an agreement on the precise terms of the Second CCP-GMD United Front was formally reached in September 1937, 2 months after the Japanese attacked Chinese nationalist troops on the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing, an event that became the pretext for the full-scale invasion of China. The Xi'an incident brought about further strains in Mao Zedong's uneasy relations with Stalin. Although obscured by the mystique of Moscow at the center of world revolution, to which Mao paid formal obeisance, hostility between the two communist leaders had been simmering for a decade. The, quote, Hunan Report of 1927, with its not-so-veiled critique of Stalin's conservatism, was followed by a long and bitter struggle between Maoist and Stalinist factions in the CCP. It is therefore hardly surprising that Mao reacted with great nationalist sensitivity to any suggestion that he was subservient to Moscow, as was charged by the Kuomintang and almost universally assumed in the West. Thus, when he was interviewed by Edgar Snow in July 1936, he replied sharply when asked whether a future, quote, Chinese-Soviet government would be comparable in its relations to Moscow to the present government of Outer Mongolia. quote, quote, we are certainly not fighting for an emancipated China in order to turn the country over to Moscow, quote, Mao exclaimed. New section, the Japanese invasion. As the Communists and the Nationalists negotiated the final details of the Second United Front in September 1937, Japanese troops were pouring into China. It was the beginning of World War II in Asia, and although it was an invasion unaccompanied by a formal declaration of war, the greater part of the Imperial Japanese Army soon was stationed in China. Kuomintang forces fled far to the west, where they established their wartime capital as Chongqing in Sichuan province. The Japanese invasion radically transformed the balance of military and political forces in the temporarily suspended civil war between the Communists and the Nationalists. Although Japan's militarists loudly announced that their aim was to, quote, save China from communism, The invasion had the unintended consequence of creating the conditions that permitted the eventual triumph of the Chinese Communists. Japanese troops quickly occupied most of the major cities of China, thus depriving the urban-based Kuomintang of their major sources of financial and political support. The invaders also destroyed the fragile and superficial administrative authority that the nationalists exercised in the rural areas of northern and central China. But the Japanese army could not effectively control the vast Chinese countryside, where the great majority of the Chinese people lived, and where the communists were experienced in organizing peasants. During the brutal Japanese occupation, much of rural China became a political vacuum, and young peasant communist cadres came to fill it, organizing peasants from patriotic resistance to the foreign invaders, promising agrarian reform, and making efforts to alleviate the economic hardships caused by the invasion and its brutalities. The result was the spectacular growth of communist power during the 8 years of Japanese occupation. In 1937, the Red Army numbered 70,000 primitively armed soldiers. In the summer of 1945, when the Japanese army surrendered, Mao's guerrilla forces had grown dramatically into a 1 million strong regular army, supported by peasant militias numbering several million part-time fighters. The membership of the Chinese Communist Party had increased to approximately 1,200,000 by 1945. Its cadres heading an underground resistance in the Japanese-occupied cities as well as organizers in villages across much of North China countryside. By 1945, the Communists effectively administered rural base areas with a population of almost 100 million. The enormous expansion of Communist peasant support in the War of Resistance against Japan was the basis for the striking Communist victories in the massive civil war at the Kuomintang following World War II. The crescendo-like succession of victories were to make Mao Zedong the ruler of the world's most populous land in 1949. Both the Japanese and Mao Zedong were essential to the victory of the Chinese Communist Revolution. The Japanese, by invading China, created a revolutionary situation in Chinese society, albeit unintentionally. But, quote, revolutionary situations do not by themselves produce revolutions. Revolutions presuppose revolutionaries who appreciate the political potentialities of the situation in which they find themselves and are prepared to act upon these potentialities in accordance with the ends they seek. In China, it was clearly Mao Zedong who had the keenest appreciation of the revolutionary conditions created in Chinese society by the Japanese invasion, and who possessed the will and strategic vision to exploit those conditions to achieve communist power. It was not predetermined, of course, that Mao Zedong was to play this historic role. Conceivably, a good number of other revolutionary leaders might have done so. But it is less conducive to historical understanding to speculate on how a revolutionary movement might have had a different outcome had it been led by different leaders than to understand the intellectual and political predispositions of the leader who actually led it. To understand how Mao Zedong transformed China's, quote, revolutionary situation into the greatest of 20th century revolutions, it is necessary to first take into account his radical reinterpretation of the inherited body of Marxist-Leninist theory, how in effect he discarded many of the basic premises of Marxism to create the ideological preconditions for revolution in an impoverished agrarian land. New section, Marxism and the, quote, thought of Mao Zedong. Before the rise of Mao Zedong, no Marxist could have conceived of a socialist revolution relying almost entirely on the support of peasants, one in which the revolutionaries fought in the countryside and largely avoided the cities and their inhabitants. A revolution that took the form of warfare between contending armies, one where the revolutionaries marched under a nationalist banner. Yet, however incongruous with the Marxist teachings that Mao claimed to be his guiding ideologies, such were the essential features of the Chinese Communist movement in 1937. The experience of the wartime years and the civil war that followed only served to deepen the rural, militaristic, and nationalist content of the Maoist movement as it approached victory in 1949. Mao Zedong was not unaware of how far the practice of the Chinese Communist movement departed from the premises of Marxism and Leninism. He was not unaware. Mao Zedong was not unaware of how far the practices of the Chinese Communist movement departed from the premises of Marxism and Leninism. Mao attempted to conceal the ideological heresies by constantly invoking such phrases as, quote, the leadership of the proletariat or, quote, proletarian hegemony, by which he meant not the presence of the actual proletariat, but rather the organized, quote, proletarian consciousness, and, quote, presumably embodied in the Communist Party. The substitution of, quote, proletarian consciousness, and, quote, for the proletariat had been implicit in Maoist ideology since the mid-1920s, when Mao began to look to the peasantry as China's truly revolutionary class. The Marxian tie between social class and political party had already become frayed, with Lenin's concept of the vanguard party, which attributed the historical initiative to the Marxist, quote, consciousness of a dedicated intellectual elite, a consciousness that was to be imposed on the amorphous mass movement of workers. The link was torn asunder when Mao retained the intellectual elite, but substituted the peasantry for the urban working class as the social basis of the party. He still proclaimed its, quote, proletarian character. For Mao, it was sufficient that the leaders of the party were guided by, quote, proletarian consciousness to ensure the proletarian nature of the organization, irrespective of its actual social composition. What then are the distinctive features of the, quote, thought of Mao Zedong, as his works were to be canonized at the 7th Congress of the CCP in 1945? One will not readily find answers to this question in Mao's official writings, which tend to disguise his ideological heresies behind an orthodox Marxist-Leninist facade and a Stalinist veneer of, quote, dialectical materialism, unquote. And I think you can make the argument that Marxist-Leninism is Stalinism, like in its theoretical manifestation, which is in Marxism-Leninism being distinct from Marxism and distinct from Leninism. Rather, the nature of Maoism is revealed only by taking into account the implications of Mao's political practice for his theories, and then by examining his writings in the historical context of his actions. By doing so, it becomes apparent that Maoism, far from being orthodox or, quote, hardline Marxism, as commonly portrayed, can better be understood in the light of Mao Zedong's departures from the fundamental premises of Marxist theory. The first and most striking of Mao's revisions is the substitution of the peasantry for the proletariat as the agent of revolution. In Marxist theory, no belief is more fundamental than faith in the redemptive historic mission of the proletariat. It is a faith that is demanded by the Marxian analysis of capitalism, which teaches that the proletariat is both the product of capitalism and its negation. Capitalism produces its own, quote, gravediggers in the form of the proletariat, in Marx's well-known image. Mao was the first revolutionary Marxist to dispense with the actual modern working class, retaining the terms, quote, proletariat and, quote, proletarian, but employing them to suggest a free-floating cluster of revolutionary values and ideas that were no longer the attributes of a specific social class. Mao Zedong's indifference to the actual proletariat was accompanied by an inversion of the Marxist view of the relationship between town and countryside in the making of modern history. In original Marxism and Leninism as well, historical progress is identified with the supremacy of the city, whereas the countryside is associated with stagnation and regression. The dynamics of modern history revolve around the activities of the two urban classes, in which capitalism is increasingly dividing society, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. This definitive dominance of the cities over the rural areas is a progressive development, an essential precondition for socialism, and for the eventual abolition of the age-old antagonism between town and countryside. While Marxists had always taken it for granted that the revolutionary forces of the city would lead the backward countryside, Mao, by contrast, believed that peasants should be mobilized to, quote, surround and overwhelm, unquote, the cities. This notion was reinforced by a powerful anti-urban bias, the product of the modern Chinese historical situation. For Mao, the city was not the Marxian revolutionary stage, but rather a foreign-dominated stage where the imperialist impingement was most far-reaching. Cities were seen as the sources of alien influences, dens of moral corruption, and bastions of political reaction. Mao Zedong's anti-urbanism was one of the intellectual preconditions facilitating his pursuit of a rural-based revolutionary strategy. It was not simply the reflection of the present revolutionary movement he came to lead. Mao Zedong's faith in the modern revolutionary capacities of the pre-modern peasantry was reinforced by a pervasive belief in, quote, the advantages of backwardness, end quote. Since the 1890s, the notion that China need not follow a Western path of development and thereby suffer the agonies of a capitalist regime had been a prominent feature of the thought of the modern Chinese intelligentsia. By taking advantage of the moral virtues inherent in its very condition of backwardness, China could leap forward to a socialist utopia. The notion of the quote, advantages of backwardness unquote, influenced the young Mao Zedong, as it did many young intellectuals of his generation. In his early quote, pre-Marxian writings, Mao deplored China's backwardness, but at the same time saw it as a great reservoir of revolutionary energy and creativity. In 1919, when Mao was editing the short-lived Shang River Review, Mao declared that, quote, our Chinese people possess great intrinsic energy, end quote. Mao. Although the people and their energies have been suppressed for, quote, thousands of years, end quote, that condition of historic backwardness seemed to augur well for the political future, with what, quote, has been accumulating for a long time, will surely burst forth quickly, end quote. Mao. The belief that backwardness is a revolutionary advantage defies the logic of Marxism and its image of economically progressive stages of development. Nonetheless, the belief became an integral part of Maoism, expressed in various ways over the revolutionary and post-revolutionary years. In an interview with Nim Wales in 1937, for example, Mao declared that in the world revolution, quote, the backward countries will be victorious first. America will probably be last, end quote. Mao. And several months later, Mao declared that, quote, the Chinese Revolution can avoid a capitalist future and can be directly linked with socialism without traversing the old historical path of the Western countries without passing through a period of bourgeois dictatorship, end quote. Mao. The nationalist-infused claim that China had the unique ability to leap over the Marxian-defined stages of development carried within it the ideological embryo of the greatest disaster of Mao Zedong's long political career, the Great Leap Forward campaign of 1958. The notion of, quote, the advantages of backwardness, unquote, reflected a lack of faith in the objective forces of history. The Marxist notion that history moves through successive phases of development in accordance with the workings of objective economic laws demands a degree of patience with historical processes that few revolutionaries possess, especially in economically backward lands. Mao Zedong certainly did not possess it. In a country so impinged by foreigners and impoverished by a web of domestic and external forms of exploitation, Mao was unwilling to retreat to the political sidelines to wait for the forces of history to do their work. Such would have been the case when he had more confidence in the, quote, objective laws of historical development than he did. Mao's faith, rather, was in determined people who can impose their subjective will on objective reality and mold the course of history in accordance with the dictates of their consciousness. The voluntarist emphasis on the human will and making of history was another belief that Mao derived in part from the anarchist literature he read in his youth, and one that was greatly reinforced by Chinese historical circumstances. Mao Zedong's faith in the peasantry as the main revolutionary class in modern China, his belief in the, quote, advantages of backwardness, and his extreme voluntarist emphasis on human will and spirit were prominent and abiding features of his political worldview. They could not, however, be easily reconciled with the tenets of the Marxist doctrine that he had embraced. But Mao's most fundamental departure from the premises of Marxism, from which all his other ideological unorthodoxies flowed, was on the issue of capitalism. Also, this is the thing where it's like people claim that they're like Marxist or whatever, like not to be like some kind of like purist thing, but it's like I feel like people don't even know what the hell that means, or like the term Marxism in and of itself is so ambiguous, like like the idea, basically what Marxism for I feel like for most people means, like who would like adopt it, um basically have the view that there should be some kind of revolution, um some kind of popularly supported revolution of some kind that overthrows the existing government and nationalizes property. That's the extent of what Marxism means. Any of like the finer theoretical points, like I think that's when people like declare themselves, "I am a Marxist." That's really what they mean, is that, which is um an extremely simple and crass version of Marxism, or a crass approach to the works of the Marxist tradition, or the works of Marx especially. Um, it's like it doesn't seem like when people call themselves Marxists, they don't even know what they're signing up for, or like they're like it doesn't particularly surprise me um, that Mao would depart in such a way um, from so-called orthodox Marxism. Granted that that's all that could really mean for has really means for a lot of people is the popularly supported government, popularly supported revolution that overthrows um, private property. Um, it seems like if that's what Marxism is to you, then it's very easy to be like, okay, what is the most largest part of the population that's most dissatisfied with the conditions of the world as they exist? Um, the peasantry. Um, it doesn't seem like such a crazy theoretical innovation. Obviously, if there's probably like pressure, there's definitely pressures and stuff on people who disagree with that. Um, but if the idea is get people mad at the government and want to overthrow government and have some kind of egalitarian base, it doesn't seem like that wild of a thing to be like, oh yeah, the peasantry is going to do that. That's just my opinion, though. Anyway, new section: Maoism and capitalism. What distinguished Marxism from most 19th century socialist theories was his acceptance of capitalism as a necessary and progressive stage of historical development. While Marx's analysis of capitalism was perhaps the most devastating critique of the system, he nevertheless saw a fully developed capitalism as the essential precondition for socialism. Capitalism created the material abundance on which a future socialist society inevitably must rest, while at the same time it produced the modern proletariat, the class destined to bring about universal human liberation. The 20th century Chinese historical situation was less than conducive to accepting the Marxist faith in the progressiveness of capitalism. Insofar as industrial capitalism developed in the early 20th century China, it did so largely under the aegis of foreign imperialism. Capitalism in China not only created in extreme form all the social evils associated with early industrialism in the West, but it did so mostly in areas under foreign domination, primarily the treaty ports. Thus, the perception of capitalism as an alien phenomenon, a universal response to early capitalist development in pre-industrial societies, was greatly intensified in China due to its foreign origins. Accordingly, many Chinese intellectuals identified capitalism with foreign imperialism, condemned both the external encroachments, and looked to indigenous sources for the socialist regeneration of the Chinese nation. These tendencies found their most powerful expression in the Maoist version of Marxism-Leninism. In the years before his conversion to Marxism, the young Mao Zedong shared with most Chinese intellectuals of his generation a deep antipathy to capitalism. In the early Fourth period, to be sure, he was attracted to various theories associated with Western capitalism, individualism, liberalism, and democracy. But however appealing these ideas, they did little to mitigate his hostility to capitalism as a social and economic system. He viewed capitalism simply as a form of oppression and exploitation, lumping capitalists together with, quote, aristocrats, as enemies of the common people, and he often used, quote, capitalism simply as a pejorative term for all types of exploitation and inequality, sometimes incongruously employing it to condemn traditional Chinese forms of sexual oppression. He charged, for example, that, quote, the slave's work of making tea and cooking is a result of capitalism, end quote. Mao. After his conversion to Marxism, Mao Zedong could no longer characterize old Chinese traditions as capitalist, but he remained reluctant to accept the Marxist-Leninist message that capitalism was a necessary stage in a universal pattern of historical development. Mao's interest in organizing workers and courting the bourgeoisie in the early 1920s was short-lived. In 1925, he had discovered the peasantry, and his revolutionary visions centered on the countryside for the following quarter of a century. In the Hunan report of early 1927, where Mao set forth his vision of peasant revolution in its most pristine form, neither capitalism nor the modern social classes associated with capitalist forces of production are mentioned. When Mao inevitably turned to the problem of capitalism in the 1930s, Mao generally pictured capitalism in China as inseparably bound up with foreign imperialism. This served to support the Maoist denial that China's socialist future was dependent on the social and material products of modern capitalism. This served to support the Maoist denial that China's socialist future was dependent on the social and material products of modern capitalism, or that the relative absence of capitalist forces of production was a barrier to the pursuit of revolutionary socialist goals. The quote, principal contradiction in Chinese society was thus not between the social classes involved in capitalist relations of production, but rather, as Mao put it in 1939, between, quote, imperialism and the Chinese nation, end quote. It was the thesis that satisfied Mao's nationalist proclivities as well as the political needs of the anti-Japanese United Front. Nonetheless, Mao Zedong could not completely ignore Marxist-Leninist teachings on the progressiveness of capitalism in economically underdeveloped lands, nor could he ignore Comintern demands on the necessity of a two-stage revolutionary process, with a quote, bourgeois democratic or capitalist stage preceding a socialist one. He attempted to satisfy the need to conform to ideological orthodoxy, or to appear to do so, and at the same time reinforce the National United Front by setting forth the theory of, quote, new democracy. Mao's treatise on New Democracy appeared early in 1940 as the communists were rapidly expanding their army and territory by mobilizing peasants for general guerrilla warfare behind Japanese lines in North China. It was as close as Mao was ever to come to accepting the Marxist proposition that socialism presupposed capitalism. He drew a clear distinction between the bourgeois democratic and socialist stages of the revolution. In the initial, quote, democratic stage, the national bourgeoisie would always play a vital role as part of a broad revolutionary alliance of four classes, which also included the proletariat, the peasantry, and the petty bourgeoisie, intellectuals, students, small shopkeepers, and so forth. Moreover, Mao acknowledged a necessary historical link between capitalism and socialism, observing that the, quote, objective mission of China's new democratic revolution was, quote, to clear the path for the development of capitalism, end quote, and thereby eventually forge, quote, a still wider path for the development of socialism, end quote. And Mao observed that the bourgeois democratic era would be lengthy. He took pains to criticize as, quote, utopian, the, quote, theory of a single revolution, end quote, and the notion of, quote, revolution at one stroke, end quote. In light of China's backwardness, he wrote in 1947, quote, it will still be necessary to permit the existence for a long time of a capitalist sector of the economy represented by the extensive petty bourgeoisie and middle bourgeoisie, end quote. Mao. A partly capitalist economy similar to the mixed economy that had been advocated by Sun Yat-sen, Mao repeatedly suggested would flourish for the foreseeable future. Yet, however politically and ideologically useful the notion of, quote, new democracy proved to be, it seemed most likely that Mao Zedong envisioned a long-term course of development that proceeded midway between capitalism and socialism, as he seemed to have suggested. It is even more unlikely that he was converted to any real Marxist faith in the historical progressiveness of capitalism, much less to the Marxian insistence that the future socialist society must inherit the material, social, and cultural achievements of a fully developed capitalist regime. Through most of his revolutionary career, he found the promise of socialism not in the development of capitalism, but rather in the masses of the, quote, people, that is to say, the peasants, who inhabited a pre-capitalist land. For the sources of revolution and of socialism, Mao looked to those sectors of Chinese society and its population least influenced by capitalism. In this respect, Mao shared a 19th century Russian-type populist skepticism about the Marxist thesis that capitalism prepared the way for socialism. Like Herzen a century earlier, he believed it was precisely the absence of capitalist development that held the promise of socialism. As Mao later argued, the backward lands were less poisoned by bourgeois ideology than the industrialized countries of the West, where the bourgeoisie and their pernicious ideas had penetrated, quote, every nook and cranny, end quote, thus stifling the revolutionary spirit. Mao Zedong's populist rejection of the thesis that capitalism is a progressive stage in historical development, and the necessary prerequisite for socialism had found implications for the theory and practice of Marxism in China. From that rejection there flowed a faith in the peasantry as the truly revolutionary class and a relative disinterest in the proletariat. A perception of the rural areas as a source of moral purity and revolutionary energy, while cities were dens of iniquity and centers of political reaction, and a skepticism about the workings of quote, objective laws of history in favor of an emphasis on the powers of human will and consciousness. It just made me think of the Seinfeld, where I can't remember what the exact context of it, but anyway, like Steinbrenner is thinking, not Steinbrenner, Peterman, right? Is it Peterman? That's his name. Elaine's boss, the fashion, the fashion house tycoon. He's like thinks that Kramer's selling or buying dope in fucking uh the in the office. And he's like throws Kramer out. He says, "I won't have you turn this office into a den of iniquity." That's what that made me think of. Whether these fundamental departures from the premises of Marxist theory still left Mao Marxist in any meaningful sense is a question that deserves serious consideration. Here it is perhaps sufficient to note that Mao's departures from Marxian orthodoxies serve well for the needs of revolution in a pre-capitalist and largely peasant land, permitting a Marxist-led party to come to power by harnessing the forces of revolt in the countryside to quote, surround and overwhelm unquote, the conservative cities. Mao Zedong fundamentally departed not only from the premises of original Marxism but from Leninism as well. Mao was a master of political organization, political intrigue, and revolutionary strategy. And in these areas he may well have been a quote natural Leninist, unquote, as he often has been characterized. But intellectually he was something other than a Leninist. Lenin had inherited the old populist dilemma of reconciling the quote spontaneity of the masses with the quote consciousness of the intelligentsia, and resolved it in a decisive fashion. The Marxist quote consciousness of the intelligentsia was to be imposed upon the quote spontaneous movement of the masses in the form of a tightly knit and highly disciplined party organization. Mao Zedong never clearly defined the relationship between the organized consciousness of the party and the spontaneous consciousness of the masses in purely Leninist fashion. The problem of the relationship between quote consciousness and quote spontaneity remained a populist dilemma that contributed to a growing tension between the leader of the party and the institution of the party. It was a tension that reinforced, even if it did not necessarily create, Mao's growing conviction that true, quote, consciousness, the combined wisdom of both the masses and the party, resided in his own person and thought. It was a tension, even if it did not necessarily create, it was a tension that reinforced, even if it did not necessarily create, Mao's growing conviction that true, quote, consciousness, the combined wisdom of both the masses and the party, resided in his own person and thought. It was this belief in his own political and ideological infallibility, which Mao shared with his party acolytes and many peasants in Shanxi, that nurtured the extraordinary phenomenon of the cult of Mao Zedong. New section, the origins of the Mao cult. The cult of Mao was born in China's rural hinterlands in the mid-1930s, at the first growing mostly spontaneously. In 1936, the American journalist Edgar Snow made his way to the remote communist base area in northern Shanxi to interview the 44-year-old Mao. Quote, there seems to be some basis for the legend of his charmed life, end quote, Snow wrote. Quote, in fact, that although he had been in scores of battles, he was once captured by enemy troops and escaped and has the world's highest reward on his head. During all these years, he has never once been wounded. End quote. Edgar Snow. And that's kind of like Edgar Snow is kind of like personally responsible for like the dissemination of Maoism as like an ideology throughout the world, like very important. Um, he's like, what's it? Is it Red Star over China? Is that what's called the book? Anyway, the belief that Mao led a quote charmed life, partly derived from the heroic experience of the Long March, concluded only a year before that interview. For the survivors of the extraordinary year-long fight through the wilderness, and the many more who were inspired by the miracle of their survival, there emerged an almost religious faith in Mao as the prophet who would lead his followers to the promised land. It was an experience that lent a sacred character to the revolutionary mission and to Mao as its invincible leader. But it was among the peasants living in the early communist base areas, perhaps more than the veterans of the Long March, that the emerging Mao cult found its deepest roots. Edgar Snow's observations of 1936 offers hints of the peasant sources of the Mao cult. In conveying his first, quote, subjective impressions of Mao, Snow dismissed the suggestion that any individual could be the savior of China, but nonetheless prophetically observed, quote, yet undeniably you feel a certain force of destiny in him. It is nothing quick or flashy, but a kind of solid and a mental vitality. You feel that whatever extraordinary there is in this man grows out of the uncanny degree to which he synthesizes and expresses the urgent demands of millions of Chinese, and especially the peasantry, those impoverished, underfed, exploited, illiterate, but kind, generous, courageous, and just now rather rebellious human beings who are the vast majority of the Chinese people, end quote. Edgar Snow. It was among the impoverished peasants of northern Shanxi that the deification of Mao Zedong began in the late 1930s. As mentioned above, the Red Army, formerly commanded by Zhu Dai, was popularly known as the, quote, Mao Zhu Army. Many peasants thought, quote, Mao Zhu to be a single godlike person who would free the peasants from oppression and restore justice in the world. The, quote, Mao Zhu myth soon became the Mao myth alone and is to become increasingly infused with ancient peasant superstitions and traditional imperial symbolism. As with the great emperors of old, portraits of Mao, with sunbeams radiating around his head, began to appear in Yunnan. Mao Zedong did little to discourage those who were constructing a hero-worshipping cult around his name and person. However incongruous the phenomenon was with the Marxist beliefs he professed. The popular cult of Mao Zedong, which had grown spontaneously during the early Yunnan years, was soon bolstered by official decrees. The rectification campaign of 1941 to 44 was sought to achieve ideological unity and political centralization in the burgeoning communist movement, established Mao Zedong's writings as the party's orthodox ideology. In 1941, when the rectification campaign was officially launched, the overwhelming majority of the Red Army soldiers in party cages were relatively new recruits, having joined the communists after the outbreak of full-scale fighting with the Japanese army in 1937. Over that 4-year period, the Red Army had grown more than fivefold to approximately 400,000 regular soldiers, while the Communist Party of China could reclaim a membership of 800,000. Most new recruits were peasants from the northern provinces, where communist forces now controlled substantial territories. Some were students and intellectuals who had made their way to Yunnan from cities throughout China to join the communist-led resistance to the Japanese invasion. One of the aims of the rectification or, quote, thought reform campaign was to indoctrinate the new recruits with basic Marxist and communist ideas in accordance with the Maoist belief that correct thought yields correct action. A closely related purpose of the rectification campaign was to carry out Mao's call for the, quote, sinification of Marxism, that is to say, the adaptation of both the substance and style of Marxism-Leninism to the peculiarities of the Chinese historical situation. It was made clear from the outset of the campaign that, quote, correct thought was not Marxism in general, but rather a, quote, sinified Marxism, and that the latter was Mao Zedong's specific interpretation of the inherited body of Marxist-Leninist theory. 5 speeches that Mao had delivered over the previous year on such topics as the reform of work habits and the need to eliminate such erroneous practices as, quote, foreign formalism, end quote, that is to say, uncritical repetition of Soviet ideas, became required text for study in the rectification movement. Passages from Mao's writings were now ubiquitously quoted in Yanan's literary and political publications. The acceptance, or in some cases the imposition, of a common ideology no doubt contributed to the discipline and political unity that were necessary for survival in the long and bitter struggle against the brutalities of the Japanese invaders, and then for success in the resumption of the civil war with the Kuomintang that inevitably followed. But the laying down of Maoist ideological orthodoxies also contributed to an extraordinary concentration of political power in the hands of their author. Perhaps it was a case where the imperatives of a harsh revolutionary war coincided with the political needs of the revolutionary leader. Mao Zedong did not limit his claims of absolute ideological supremacy to matters of revolutionary strategy and military tactics, realms where the efficacy of his ideas had already been demonstrated in practice. He also felt the need to establish his credentials as an orthodox and creative Marxist philosopher, perhaps to justify, or perhaps to obscure his departures from Marxian orthodoxies in so many other areas, just as Lenin and Stalin had felt such a need before him in their turgid and lengthy philosophical works on, quote, dialectical materialism. In 1937, Mao presented his essays on practice and on contradiction as his contribution to Marxist philosophy. While these had the virtue of being much briefer and considerably more lively in style than Stalin's tedious tome on, quote, materialist philosophy, the originality of Mao's philosophical writings is questionable, and the relationship to his innovations in revolutionary strategy rather tenuous. Nonetheless, during the rectification movement, the two essays were celebrated as creative contributions to the development of the Marxist philosophical tradition and were required reading for intellectuals and party cadres. The rectification campaign also established Mao Zedong as the final arbiter on the form and content of artistic and literary expressions. In the spring of 1942, Mao convened two meetings attended by the many writers, artists, and other intellectuals who had made their way to Yan'an to join the Communist Revolution and the resistance to the Japanese invaders. Invoking both Lenin and Lu Xun, modern China's most celebrated writer, Mao lectured his audience on their social and political responsibilities, demanding that writers give primacy to political over artistic criteria, and insisting that, quote, the duty of learning from the workers, peasants, and soldiers precedes the task of educating them, end quote. Mao's talks were less remarkable for what he had to say about literature and art than the fact that he had arrogated to himself and to the Communist Party that he now totally dominated the authority to judge what was acceptable revolutionary literature and what was not. The potential for political repression inherent in that claim stood in striking contrast to the socially liberating impulses that Yan'an had come to symbolize, and which had done much to encourage many urban intellectuals and students to embark on the dangerous journey to join the communists in the Northwest. The repressive potential of the establishment of literary orthodoxies was apparent even as Mao spoke in the Yan'an Forum. Several months before the forum convened, on the 8th of March, International Women's Day, the noted writer Ding Ling sharply criticized the party's hypocritical treatment of women in Yan'an. She was dismissed as an editor of Yunan's main newspaper, Liberation Daily, and shipped off to labor in the surrounding countryside for several months. A more tragic fate befell Wang Shi-wai, a young communist writer and translator in Shanghai who had migrated to Yan'an in 1936. Although his satirical and iconoclastic writings had ruffled official feathers for years, it was in 1942 that he got into trouble for his critique of the new hierarchy of official ranks and rewards, quote, the 3 classes of clothing and 5 grades of food, end quote. Wang was subjected to a quasi-trial of mass criticism and eventually jailed at a prison just outside Yan'an. He was executed when the communists temporarily evacuated Yan'an in 1947, apparently on orders from the communist general He Long, but contrary to Mao's instructions. It was ironic but not illogical that Chinese communists were punished for expressing, quote, Maoist ideas. Mao Zedong, after all, had been a champion of sexual equality since 1919, when he had written the moving series of articles on Miss Zhao's suicide. and his antipathy to bureaucratic rank and privilege was well known. But it was one thing for Mao to set forth such ideas, it was quite another for others to do so in criticism of the party that Mao headed. The canonization of Mao's writings on the rectification campaign was a further step in the construction of the Mao cult, adding an aura of ideological infallibility to the political supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party that Mao already had achieved. It was also a reaffirmation of the Chinese Communist movement's independence from Moscow. The Chinese Party and its leader, it was implied, had their own version of Marxism-Leninism appropriate to Chinese historical conditions. Both leader and ideology in Yunnan now stood on an equal plane with their counterparts in Moscow. It was a barely disguised challenge to Stalin's claim to universal logical and political authority in the international communist movement, but not one to which Stalin could easily respond, for it came at a time when the Soviet Union was desperately struggling to survive the massive Nazi invasion. The political potency of the cult of Mao Zedong was fully revealed in April 1945 when the Chinese Communist Party convened its 7th Congress. As the long war of resistance to the Japanese invaders was approaching its triumphant conclusion, the leaders of a party which could now claim 1,200,000 members gathered to celebrate the leadership of Mao Zedong. His writings and speeches were proclaimed the sole guide for the party in the future, as well as credited for its successes in the past. All delegates to the Congress lavished praise on Mao, but few more ardently than Liu Shaoqi, now second to Mao in the increasingly hierarchical party organization. Liu declared Mao not only the, quote, greatest revolutionary and statesman in Chinese history, end quote, but also China's, quote, greatest theoretician and scientist, end quote. And he hailed the canon of Mao's thought as a new and higher stage in a universally valid body of Marxist-Leninist theory. The construction of the Mao cult now began to embrace not only celebrations of Mao's thought but also his person. Snow had observed in 1936 that, quote, the role of his personality in the movement was clearly immense, end quote, but as yet there was no, quote, ritual of hero worship built around him, end quote. But hero worshipping began soon enough, partly spontaneously and partly under official auspices. Foreign visitors to Yan'an in the early 1940s observed that Mao was less informal and more remote, both physically and spiritually, even though he retained the, quote, personal habits of a peasant, end quote, as Snow put it. Mao's portrait appeared on village walls and buildings in the expanding communist-governed areas. Some were life-size and others showed Mao's face illuminated by the rays of the sun in traditional imperial fashion. In books and songs, Mao came to be worshipped as, quote, the great savior, end quote, and the, quote, star of salvation, end quote. The new Chinese communist anthem, The East is Red, revered Mao in almost Christ-like fashion, quote, the East is red, the sun rises, in China a Mao Zedong is born, end quote. The growth of the Mao cult went hand in hand with the concentration of political power. In 1941, at the beginning of the rectification movement, virtually all party leaders, save Mao, were forced to make public, quote, self-criticisms of past political and ideological errors. It was not a conventional political purge, and that Mao's opponents, past and present, were not punished, and for the most part were allowed to retain their official positions, but the mandatory ritual of self-flagellation left little doubt about who was the supreme leader. The unchallenged and virtually total control of the CCP that Mao Zedong achieved during the rectification campaign was formalized at the 7th Party Congress in April 1945. To the chairmanship of the Politburo, the party's highest policy-making organ, Mao added the chairmanship of the Secretariat, the body through which the top party leaders exercised centralized control over local party organizations. Mao's political dominance was further augmented by fortifying his ideological monopoly. The new party constitution adopted by the 7th Congress formally proclaimed, quote, the thought of Mao Zedong, end quote, to be the party's guiding ideology. New section, Civil War, the Last Phase, 1945 to 1949. As Japan's defeat in the Pacific War approached, both the Communists and the Nationalists prepared to resume the only partly suspended Civil War. The United Front for Resistance to the Japanese invaders had meanwhile remained largely on paper. 1 second. I appreciate your patience. Sorry about that. As Japan's defeat in the Pacific War approached, the Communists and the Nationalists prepared to resume the only partly suspended civil war. The United Front for Resistance to the Japanese invaders had meanwhile remained largely on paper. Save for changing the name of the main force of the Red Army to the, quote, 8th Route Army, theoretically part of the Nationalist Army, shortly after the Xi'an incident, Mao Zedong had no intention of repeating the mistakes of the mid-1920s. Communist military forces were not again to be placed under the command of Chiang Kai-shek. Thus the quote, 8th Route Army, along with the smaller new 4th Army, an amalgamation of communist guerrilla units in central China, remained under the ultimate command of Mao Zedong. Not only did the communist and nationalist armies fail to sustain any meaningful degree of cooperation in resisting the Japanese, they fought each other, especially after a clash in January 1941, when a large Kuomintang force surrounded and attacked the headquarters of the new 4th Army in Anhui province, killing or capturing thousands of communist troops in a fierce week-long battle. Mao and Chiang Kai-shek assumed full-scale civil war would resume once Japan was defeated. During the long war years of the power and popularity of the communists had grown enormously as they organized effective guerrilla warfare against the foreign invaders in the rural areas of North China. Through a combination of nationalist and socioeconomic appeals and promises of security, the communists had won overwhelming support among the peasantry of North China and considerable sympathy in the cities as well, especially among students and intellectuals. The flight of most of the nationalist army to far western China had allowed the communists to break out of their impoverished sanctuary in northern Shanxi and establish base areas in many parts of north and central China. In the spring of 1945, Mao Zedong claimed that 95,500,000 people lived in rural areas under communist control. The Red Army had grown into a highly disciplined force of almost 1 million dedicated soldiers, having increased 20-fold since 1937, and local peasant militias had been organized throughout the northern and central provinces. Still, when Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Kuomintang appeared to have the overwhelming advantage. Chiang Kai-shek's army numbered 4 million soldiers, 4 times the size of the communist forces. Moreover, the nationalists, unlike the communists, had a sizable air force and were equipped with tanks and modern artillery. And the nationalists had the support of the U.S., which provided generous amounts of money and arms. The resumption of the civil war was delayed and complicated by Stalin in an act that Mao must have regarded as yet another Soviet betrayal. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin secretly assured Roosevelt and Churchill that the Soviet Union would not support the Chinese communists and agreed that the Kuomintang was the only political party capable of ruling China, a view the Soviet dictator repeated at the Potsdam Conference several months later. In return for joining the war against Japan and not supporting the Chinese communists, Stalin was promised the return of the Chinese Eastern Railroad and Port Arthur, Tsarist Russia concessions in Manchuria lost to Japan in 1905. Stalin did not inform Mao Zedong of these, quote, big power understandings. Mao became painfully aware of the secret agreements only on the eve of the Japanese surrender in August 1945, when the startling news arrived that the Soviet Union had signed a treaty of alliance with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. The Chinese Communist Party could no longer expect to receive Soviet assistance when the Civil War resumed, although U.S. support for the Kuomintang certainly would continue. Thus, Mao was no longer able to resist Soviet pressure to seek a, quote, coalition government with the Kuomintang, and one in which the Chinese Communist Party would now surely be the very junior partner. At the end of August, Mao suddenly flew to Chongqing to meet Chiang Kai-shek, whom he had not seen since the days of the first Kuomintang Chinese Communist Party alliance in the mid-1920s. Mao must have reflected on his long and contentious relationship with Stalin. Mao could hardly have forgotten that in the great revolutionary upsurge of the mid-1920s, Stalin had condemned the, quote, excesses of the Chinese peasantry, whose revolutionary fervor Mao so eloquently championed. Stalin, too, had been the architect of the first Kuomintang Chinese Communist Party alliance, which had left the Chinese Communists defenseless against Chiang Kai-shek's Soviet-trained army in 1927. Stalin also had sponsored the young Chinese Communist leaders who fought Mao since the late 1920s and had removed Mao from power during the Jiangxi Soviet period, a struggle which had continued into the early 1940s. And now, on the eve of victory over Japan, with an indigenous Chinese Communist movement more powerful than ever and prepared to contend for national power, Stalin had once again betrayed a Communist Party that refused to submit to his control. Yet Mao could hardly afford to openly defy Stalin, however great his anger at the Soviet dictator must have been, for the Soviet Union was the only possible source of outside support to counter-growing American political, financial, and military assistance to the Kuomintang. Moreover, the mystique of Moscow's authority as the sacred center of world revolution remained powerful, inhibiting the open expression of views critical of the high priest of what was still called the, quote, international communist movement, end quote. For Mao Zedong in 1945, public defiance of Stalin remained unthinkable, even though at the recently concluded Potsdam Conference the Soviet dictator had again said that the Kuomintang was the only political party capable of governing China. Thus Mao dutifully, if morosely, journeyed to the Chongqing to negotiate with Chiang Kai-shek. Mao expected that the talks would prove fruitless, save to deflect accusations that he had not done everything possible to avoid civil war. Mao Zedong spent 6 futile weeks negotiating in Chongqing from late August to early October, meeting personally 4 times with Chiang Kai-shek. There was a superficial air of cordiality, but both were marking time, performing to appease public opinion in China and politicians in Washington and Moscow. Mao and Chiang were maneuvering for advantage in the final civil war that both assumed to be inevitable. Both believed in their own fashion that, quote, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, end quote. With the breakdown of the talks and Mao's return to Yunnan on October 10, 1945, clashes between communist and nationalist military units increased in frequency and intensity. Sporadic fighting between the two Chinese forces had continued throughout the 8-year Japanese occupation. With the Japanese defeat in August 1945, communist and nationalist armies had raced to accept the surrender of Japanese troops and to acquire arms and territory. When the Chongqing talks ended, warfare accelerated, especially in Manchuria, where most remaining Japanese troops and stores of arms were located. Manchuria contained much of China's natural resources and a good part of its tiny modern industrial base. The United States now became more directly involved in the Chinese Civil War. 50,000 American troops were dispatched to North China, where they occupied major cities, which were then turned over to the Kuomintang. And the U.S. airlifted nationalist troops to Manchuria to occupy strategic points before either Chinese or Russian communists could reach them. The policies of the Soviet Union in post-war Manchuria were ambiguous and often contradictory, reflecting Stalin's dual role as the heir of Imperial Russia's expansionist ambitions and his posture as leader of an international revolutionary movement. In accordance with Allied wartime agreements, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, just a week before this Japanese surrender. And Soviet troops occupied much of Manchuria, ostensibly to accept the surrender of Japanese troops. The Russians initially assisted the Chinese communists in occupying territory and acquiring arms. Then in November, as fighting between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party forces accelerated, the Russians suddenly demanded that Chinese communist troops abandon the major cities and lines of transportation in Manchuria within a week, threatening to send tanks to drive them out if necessary. The Soviet withdrawal of support of the Chinese communists reflected in part Stalin's fear of a rival communist regime in China. Stalin had already told Mao, albeit indirectly, that the Chinese Revolution had little hope of success and had advised the Chinese communists to join the nationalist government and disband the Red Army. Soviet actions in Manchuria must have seemed to Mao yet another example of Stalin's duplicitous behavior. Nonetheless, Mao had no choice but to order communist troops to withdraw from the cities and other strategic points, but the relations between Mao and Stalin, long strained, were further poisoned. The strains were temporarily alleviated in the spring of 1946 when Soviet troops withdrew from Manchuria, turning over substantial quantities of captured Japanese arms to the Chinese communists as they left. But the Russian departure was not complete. The Soviets retained their most prized Manchurian territories, the Pacific ports of Dairen and Port Arthur. The question of their return to China was one of the main problems in Sino-Russian relations that would confront Mao after 1949, not to be resolved until after Stalin's death in 1953. As Soviet troops were withdrawing from Manchuria, nationalist and communist armies were maneuvering to gain the advantage in the final battle that both Mao and Chiang expected. Although fighting between the two had never ceased, full-scale warfare had been delayed by the efforts of the United States to mediate a political settlement. To that end, General George Marshall, a U.S. Army Chief of Staff during World War II and now Special Envoy of President Truman, had arrived in China in late December 1945. With a truce Marshall managed to negotiate broke down completely in the spring of 1946, and by the summer, China was rapidly sliding into massive civil war. In 1946, the nationalists enjoyed an overwhelming material advantage. The Kuomintang armies numbered over 4 million, nearly 4 times the number of soldiers in the Red Army, which had been renamed the People's Liberation Army. The nationalists had even greater superiority in military technology, including a substantial air force, heavy artillery, and tanks. Of such modern weapons, the communists had virtually nothing. Moreover, the Kuomintang received many billions of dollars in U.S. financial aid. The captured Japanese military supplies that the departing Soviet army in Manchuria turned over to the Chinese communists in 1946 were minuscule in comparison. Nationalist generals boasted they had at least a 10-to-1 military budget over the communists, and on the eve of the outbreak of full-scale civil war, Stalin told Mao that the Chinese Communist cause was hopeless and advised him to seek an accommodation with Chiang Kai-shek. Although Mao Zedong was now confident of a communist military victory, he expected a prolonged struggle. In part, his confidence was based on evidence that the corruption and demoralization afflicted the GMD and made the Nationalist Army far weaker than it appeared on paper, an assessment shared by a good number of American military officers who had been assigned to the Chongqing during the Pacific War. But in great part, Mao's confidence in eventual victory was based on his faith in the decisive historical role of the human will and spirit, a long-standing voluntarist faith that had been greatly fortified by the extraordinary growth of the Red Army during the anti-Japanese War. As China was plunging into all-out civil war in the summer of 1946, he told an American journalist, quote, "We have only Millet plus rifles to rely on, but history will finally prove that our Millet plus rifles is more powerful than Chiang Kai-shek's aeroplanes plus tanks." Unquote. Mao Zedong, who took overall command of communist forces during the 3-year civil war, was at the height of his powers as a military strategist. Mao no longer counseled a reliance on the tactics of guerrilla warfare that had been so successfully employed against the Japanese invaders. He now emphasized what he termed, quote, mobile warfare, end quote. The tactics he had largely borrowed from Sun Tzu, a military strategist of 5th century BC. second. Those ancient tactics were adapted and developed on the Jinggang Mountains in the late 1920s during the Jiangxi period and on the Long March. They were now employed on a far larger scale, so the army that Mao commanded was no longer a small band of fighters struggling for sheer survival, but a force numbering over 1 million soldiers. Nonetheless, many of the well-honed practices of earlier revolutionary eras remained: surprise, deception, rapid movements, unconventional maneuvers, secrecy of troop movements, and, as Mao especially emphasized, quote, concentrating a superior force to destroy the enemy forces one by one, end quote. Mao also instructed the Red Army to refrain from attacking big cities, to aim to, quote, wipe out the enemy's effective strength, end quote, rather than hold a particular place, and to and to support fuck what's going on here. Fuck. No, so 1 second, sorry. I think there's something some page bullshit. I'm guessing this is the page that it connects to. So let me see. Mao also instructed the Red Army to refrain from attacking big cities, to aim to, quote, wipe out the enemy's effective strength, end quote, rather than hold a particular place. And two, avoid battles of attrition. But perhaps most important was the old Maoist tactic of, quote, luring the enemy deep, end quote, which was employed on a massive scale in the crucial battle for Manchuria. With the end of World War II, Chiang Kai-shek was determined to establish control over the vast and strategically vital territory of Manchuria. As the Russian army withdrew in mid-1946, Chiang hurriedly dispatched more than 1 million of his best troops to occupy the former Japanese puppet state. Most were well equipped with new American arms, and many were transported to the northeast by the U.S. Air Force. They were the cream of the Nationalist Army. The battle for Manchuria became in part a personal contest between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. Mao drew up the battle plans for the Manchurian campaign, as he did for most of the more important military engagements of the Civil War, which were then mainly carried out by the Communist Fourth Field Army under the command of Lin Biao, the most skilled of the PLA's generals. And Chiang Kai-shek, at a crucial point in the battle, assumed personal command of the nationalist forces in Manchuria. It was an unwise decision. By the time Chiang took over the Manchurian command, the nationalist army, its lines of supply and communication overextended, had been demoralized and put on the defensive by the brilliant maneuvers of Lin Biao's army. The Kuomintang forces, as was their habit, were now concentrated on the railroads in around 3 cities in central and southern Manchuria: Changchun, Shenyang, then known as Mukden, and Jinzhou, Qinchao. The latter was the smallest of the three, but also the most strategically important. Mao recognized for the town was essential both for supplying the Kuomintang troops in Manchuria and for their retreat. Thus, in early September 1948, he instructed Lin Biao to concentrate his forces to capture Jinzhou, quote, leaving the larger enemy forces at Changchun and Shenyang alone, end quote. With the large Kuomintang armies defending Shenyang and Changchun isolated, Lin Biao ordered most of his army to attack the town of Jinzhou, throwing 13 columns, several 100,000 troops in all in rapid succession against the 100,000 nationalist defenders. The town was captured on October 15th, with half the nationalist soldiers going over to the communists. Belated Kuomintang reinforcements were destroyed or dispersed. Changchun fell on October 19th and Shenyang on November 2nd. In all, the Manchurian campaign resulted in the loss of 500,000 of Chiang Kai-shek's best troops, many of whom deserted, joining the communists. Lin Biao's 4th Field Army nearly tripled in size as a result, growing to over 800,000 soldiers who were now well equipped with captured American arms. The Manchurian campaign illustrated on a gigantic scale the efficacy of classic Maoist military principles. The communist victory in the Civil War was not, of course, primarily the result of Mao's military brilliance. A more important part was played by the overwhelming support of the peasantry, especially in the northern and central provinces, in large measure a response to communist policies which attempted to alleviate the most pressing economic problems of the impoverished rural inhabitants. The participation of the peasantry in the Revolutionary War against the Kuomintang, whether as recruits for the Red Army or local militias, contributor of goods and money, workers in the self-sufficient economies of the blockaded communist base areas, or providers of intelligence, was the essential condition for the conduct of what Mao termed, quote, People's War. And the latter, in turn, was the precondition for employing the distinctive military tactics he had devised. However efficacious, these could not be successfully employed unless the army enjoyed genuine popular support, as Mao emphasized time and again. The tie between the CCP and the poorest peasants had been strengthened during the last years of the Civil War, when the communists adopted a radical land reform policy, redistributing the holdings holdings of landlords and rich peasants. During the anti-Japanese war, in accordance with nationalistic United Front policies, Mao insisted on a very moderate reformist land policy that emphasized the reduction of rents, limits on usury, and the promotion of cooperative methods of farming. In 1947, however, with the Civil War raging, Mao supported a radical agrarian policy that sanctioned the confiscation of the land holdings of landlords and their distribution among the landless and land-short peasants. In large part, the radical agrarian policy, which proceeded under the egalitarian slogan, quote, land to the tiller, was a political response to the spontaneous social radicalism of the poorer peasants, who were the most numerous and ardent supporters of the communists and who filled the ranks of the People's Liberation Army. The social radicalism that erupted into violent class conflict in the villages of North China in 1947 marked a major change in the appeals and nature of the Communist Revolution. During the 8 years of the Japanese invasion and occupation, peasants and others flocked to the nationalist banner hoisted by Mao Zedong, and a movement which promised to organize resistance against the foreign invaders and to bring some degree of stability to a war-disrupted economy. While Maoism was also a doctrine that combined nationalism with social revolution, an uneasy but powerful combination, during the wartime years, Mao muted the social revolutionary impulses in favor of national struggle and reformist economic measures. During the last phase of the Civil War, however, it was class struggle rather than nationalism that propelled the revolutionary movement, foreshadowing the violent social revolution that was to mark nationwide land reform campaign of 1950 to 52. New section, the unification of China. In the fall of 1948, Mao Zedong optimistically predicted that the Kuomintang could be defeated by the summer of 1951. Events moved even more rapidly than he had anticipated. The victory in Manchuria in early November 1948 proved decisive, demoralizing the Kuomintang, giving the communists numerical superiority for the first time, and opening the way for the conquest of North and Central China. In less than 4 months from the beginning of the Manchurian campaign in October 1948, to the conclusion of the North China Campaign in January 1949. The Kuomintang had lost over 1.5 million soldiers, and the PLA had expanded to a regular force of over 2 million, supported by large peasant militias and auxiliaries. With the military and political situation hopeless, Chiang Kai-shek sued for peace, but Mao was now uncompromising, insisting on punishment for war criminals, and as he repeatedly charged, Chiang Kai-shek was, quote, China's #1 war criminal, as well as, quote, chieftain of the Kuomintang bandit gang and bogus president of the Nanking government, end quote. Chiang, defeated and demoralized, resigned the presidency of the Nanjing regime, although he did not give up such military power as he still retained. And there was a temporary lull in the fighting while other nationalist leaders attempted to negotiate a peaceful solution. At this point, Stalin made yet another contribution to the increasingly hostile relationship between Mao and Moscow. On the eve of the Chinese Communist victory, Stalin advised that the People's Liberation Army should not cross the Yangtze, and that the civil war conclude with a communist regime in North China and the Kuomintang state in the south. The ostensible purpose of this scheme was to avoid provoking direct U.S. intervention. More likely, Stalin feared the challenge Mao would pose to Moscow as the leader of a rival communist regime in a united China. Mao Zedong, in any event, once again ignored Stalin's advice and on April 20th ordered a general offensive to complete the conquest of the mainland and unite all of China under communist rule. On September 21st, 1949, 10 days before he stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing to proudly proclaim the establishment of the People's Republic, Mao Zedong celebrated the revolutionary victory with a speech to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, a united front body established in 1946 in the failed effort to form a coalition government. Quote, fellow delegates, we are all convinced that our work will go down in the history of mankind, demonstrating that the Chinese people, comprising 1/4 of humanity, have now stood up. The Chinese have always been a great, courageous, and industrious nation. It is only in modern times that they have fallen behind, and that was due entirely to oppression and exploitation by foreign imperialism and domestic reactionary governments. For over a century, our forefathers never stopped waging unyielding struggles against domestic and foreign oppressors, including the revolution of 1911, led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a great forerunner in the Chinese Revolution. Ours will no longer be a nation subject to insult and humiliation. We have stood up, end quote. Mao. To his audience, Mao must have seemed more a Chinese nationalist than a Marxist revolutionary, and so it appeared to many in China and abroad at the time of the founding of the People's Republic of China on the 1st of October 1949. Okay, and that's the end of Chapter 4 of Mao Zedong, A Political and Intellectual Portrait by Maurice Meisner. Chapter 4 was titled Nationalism and Social Revolution, 1935 to 1949. Thank you so much for listening.